Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chan and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos Volume 4, also known as Shapolang by Priest, and we're moving on to the next section of Arc 14. That's going to be chapters 109 through 111. Enjoy! Chapter 109, 10 Years. The guard was so terrified his soul nearly fled his body. Chang'eng shoved the stupefied man aside, hair standing on end as his limbs turned colder than the chilly Jiangbei weather. At first, all Gu Yuan felt was the ache in his chest. Now that he had spat out this mouthful of filthy blood, he actually felt much better. Yet, he couldn't seem to stop coughing. The front of his robes was quickly stained red. Blind to his surroundings, Gu Yuan waved a frantic hand. "Don't tell anyone." "I'm fine." Chang'eng dragged himself back from the edge of complete mental breakdown and was about to pick Gu Yuan up when the man slurred out his name. "Chang'eng." He sucked in a breath and pressed his ear to Gu Yuan's lips. Nose filled with the stench of blood, even Gu Yuan's keen sense of smell abandoned him, leaving only his mind struggling weakly for clarity. He muttered haltingly, "Chang'eng, Prince Yen will arrive soon. Don't disclose what happened here, especially not to him." Chang'eng's heart nearly cracked open. "Call the medics," he shouted as the rims of his eyes turned red. The guard turned on his heel and ran. Yao Jun was about to keel over from exhaustion. He was starting to suspect the Jiangbei garrison's location had terrible feng shui. They had lost their first commander just days ago, and now a second collapse had happened. This one, an indispensable figure they could not afford to lose under any circumstances. Yao Jun turned to Liao Zhen, who had arrived with Chang'eng, and asked weakly, "Is the Great Master here to conduct burial rites for Zhonglao? There's no rush on that front. Perhaps you can recite some scripture to expel malign energies from the Jiangbei garrison first?" Great Master Liao Zhen gazed at him in sympathy and signed, "The mute cannot recite scripture." Dang. Chang'eng had thought the time he spent studying with Miss Chun was sufficient to render him half a doctor. Only now, in crisis, did he realize that there was one patient who could always leave him helpless. The instant he saw Gu Yuan's blood, his mind went blank, as if all the medical texts he'd memorized had been returned wholesale to Miss Chun. He could forget about practicing any actual medicine. The best field medics of the Jiangbei garrison clustered inside the freshly cleared commander's tent, every one of them crackling with nerves. Chang'eng sat right beside Gu Yuan, holding his hand in a vice grip, not caring if he was in the way. All the medics trembled with fear in his presence. Liao Zhen stood outside the door and gazed at Prince Yan in worry. Stories of how Chang'eng had transformed into a needle-covered hedgehog in the aftermath of the capital siege had reached his ears as well. If Chang'eng had a flare-up here in the Jiangbei garrison, no one could subdue him. But to Liao Zhen's surprise, Chang'eng was perfectly calm. He didn't show even the slightest sign of madness. Gu Yuan's slurred instructions forbidding his subordinate from informing Chang'eng were like a stabilizing force pinning his soul firmly into his body. He suddenly felt that he had been demanding too much of Gu Yuan. Without realizing, he had grown more and more unstable, to the point that not a day went by without him giving Gu Yuan some cause to worry. On the other hand, Gu Yuan had kept Chang'eng firmly in the darkness as to the origin of the myriad injuries, both new and old, on his body. Chang'eng could visualize clearly all the times Gu Yuan had compounded old hurts with fresh wounds and instructed onlookers to silence, all to protect Chang'eng from concern. "Your Highness," one of the medics cautiously stepped forward. "The marshal's collapse is due partially to accumulated fatigue from overwork. Also, the various untreated injuries he's acquired over these past few years while fighting on the front lines have damaged his lungs. That blood he spat up has been stagnating in his body for a very long time. Though it was a frightful sight, the fact that he expelled it may be a positive sign." Chang'eng pressed his lips against Gu Yuan's wrist in silence and tugged his tangled thoughts into order. But after feeling at length, he still couldn't detect anything from Gu Yuan's jumbled pulse. He had no choice but to trust the doctor's diagnosis and murmur his acknowledgement. "What about medication? Have you settled on a prescription?" The medic hesitated. Given the marshal's condition, it would be best for him to refrain from over-medicating. What he needs most is simply rest. The moment these words left his mouth, the medic knew he had asked the impossible. He glanced cautiously at Changgung's hand, which was clutching Gu Yuan so hard veins were bulging along the back of it. Terrified that Prince Yan was about to bite his head off, he trembled in fear. But in the end, Prince Yan said nothing and merely sat in a daze. Eventually, he politely cupped his hands. "You have my sincere gratitude. Thank you all for doing your utmost for the marshal." Surprised by this unexpected consideration, the team of medics filed out of the commander's tent, newly energized. When they had gone, Liao Zhan stepped quietly into the tent. He stood before Changgung for a while, face creased with worry. Feeling he ought to help somehow, he touched a hand to Gu Yuan's furrowed brow and silently invoked the Buddha's name as a meager contribution. Changgung sighed. "Please don't, Great Master. He has an acrimonious relationship with the Buddha. Are you trying to wake him in a rage by reading scripture in his presence? Do you have your wooden bird? Send a letter to Chen Qingshu." Liao Zhan looked up at him. His face was expressionless. "Ask her how many things she's helped Gu Zishi hide from me." "Your Highness, are you all right?" Liao Zhan sighed. Changgung's shoulders quivered, and for a moment Liao Zhan thought he would break down. But Changgung did no such thing. He gazed at Gu Yuan for a time, before instead doing something that nearly scared Liao Zhan out of his wits. Holding Gu Yuan's hand in that unforgiving grip, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to Gu Yuan's forehead, there, before Liao Zhan's very eyes. This kiss was as earnest as it was devoted, nearly reverent. Liao Zhan gaped, dumbstruck. Changgung's eyes never left Gu Yuan. When he finally spoke, it was difficult to say to whom his words were addressed. "I'm fine. Don't worry." Stricken, Great Master Liao Zhan fled the tent, silently chanting the words, "Lust is an unworthy pursuit," and leaving Changgung to sit his vigil in silence. During the latter half of the night, Gu Yuan sank from blank unconsciousness into deep slumber. He tossed and turned, as though caught in some nightmare. When Gu Yuan had suffered a fever after his stint in the imperial dungeons, he had also been restless in sleep. But if he sensed someone by his side, he would settle. When Changgung recalled this, he leaned against the side of the bed and gathered Gu Yuan into his arms. Over in General Zhong's morning hall, the candles glowed throughout the night. If the old man lying beneath the 9 springs could see his disciple now, who knew what he would say to Gu Yuan when he visited him in his dreams? Changgung tightened his embrace, cradling Gu Yuan in his arms. For the first time, his heart was absent both the dependence he felt toward his little Yifu and the desire he felt toward the man he loved. Instead, he held Gu Yuan as one would hold a precious, fragile child. In the days he had desperately pined after Gu Yuan, Changgung had wondered on countless occasions how different their relationship would be if only he had been born 10 or 20 years earlier. Now, in the damp cold of the Jiangbei front line, that impossibly wide span of 10 years shrank down to bare centimeters, easily traversed by a single step. Unfortunately, no matter how many years Changgung matured overnight, it did little to hinder the far westerner's schemes. That evening, the conflict between the holy emissary and the Pope resolved in the emissary's favor. They agreed to mount a sneak attack on Great Liang's naval forces. The assault was slated for nightfall, but before they could move out, the watchtower sent word that Jiangbei had tightened their defense perimeter and entered the highest state of alert. Mr. Jia charged into the battle-ready flagship with the news. "Your Holiness, Gu Yuan arrived too quickly. Great Liang's navy is no suckling infant. The enemy has already raised their guard. Meeting force with force like this goes against all—" He was still speaking when the holy emissary barged in after him, an ugly expression on his face. "No one will be changing the plan." The holy emissary was a highly trusted and brilliant noble young master, arrogant with youth and status. He had the powerful backing of the king and aristocracy, and the authority to contend with the Holy See and the army. Mere days ago, he had been tooting his own horn, declaring Great Liang's navy and Black Iron Battalion insignificant threats. He'd never expected to eat his words so soon. Regardless of all else, the holy emissary's ego couldn't bear the humiliation. The Pope had also lost his patience. "Set aside your personal feelings on the matter. There is no place for petty grudges in the middle of a war." No one is taking this less than seriously, Your Holiness. The emissary flushed with anger. What if it's a bluff? In that case, this is our best opportunity to attack. And if it's not? Mr. Jaw countered. Impossible. The holy emissary shot him a venomous glare. That puny fleet lacks any real combat ability. You're afraid to take risks. What utter nonsense! Mr. Jaw spat. Mind your words, good sir, the holy emissary said coldly, turning away and pulling out a roll of parchment. Gentlemen, I am not here for discussion. As the representative of the highest authority in the Holy Empire, I signed the troop mobilization order half an hour ago. This is a copy. Please read it carefully. Mr. Jaw's face flushed with rage, but before he could voice his objections, the sea monster flagship rumbled with a long, low sound like a sigh and began to move. Have you lost your mind? Mr. Jaw burst out. He drew his sword without thinking. Stop this! Immediately! The holy emissary unsheathed his own gold and gem-encrusted cavalry saber. It is our honor to lay our lives on the line fighting for the infinite glory of our king. We did not come to the front lines to hole up in our harbor and pray on our knees. What are you— Enough! Mr. Jaw was cut off by the Pope's furious shout. Apologies. Does your holiness have further instruction? The emissary scoffed. The Pope's face twitched uncontrollably. The flagship was already leaving the harbor, and he had reached the end of his patience. He relented. If you insist on seeing this ridiculous plan through, at the very least allow my people to command on the battlefield. This was what the holy emissary had hoped for all along. On the infinitesimal chance this operation failed, the Pope was a ready-made scapegoat. Dang. Sneering at Mr. Jaw, he sheathed his sword and shouted his order. Full speed ahead! That night, the far western Sea Dragon warships donned their disguises and dispersed along the extensive Liangjiang battlefront. They slipped quietly past the Jiangbei garrison and prepared to make landfall bathed in the glory of God. Thousands of kilometers away in the north, the 18 tribes had sent their second group of envoys to negotiate with Great Liang. Cao Chunhua had also hurried to the northern border. Like Chen Qingxu, he had traveled extensively in the wild northern grasslands and knew the Tianlang tribes inside and out. His expertise was essential in navigating the delicate situation on the northern front. He joined Shen Yi and met with the barbarian envoy just beyond the Black Iron Battalion's defensive perimeter. Through the field scope, Cao Chunhua watched the envoy's party approach, trailed by a baggage convoy. They had once again come bearing gifts. And, judging by the wagon's exterior and the depth of their tracks, it seemed this gift was violet gold. A young man in his mid-20s rode at the center of the group. At first glance, he appeared to be their leader, but upon closer inspection, the young man's face was deathly pale, tight with obvious panic. Wedged between several other horses, he seemed more like a captive than anything else. Shen Yi didn't have the nerve to whisper to Chen Qingxu. He quietly asked Cao Chunhua, "Who is that man?" Cao Chunhua peered through the field scope. Jiala Yinghuo's second son. What? Shen Yi frowned. Are you sure? Cao Chunhua batted his eyelashes at him and tapped him on the chest with gracefully curved fingers. Ayo, General Shen, Shen Xiansheng, there are two things in which my memory has never failed me. I never forget a face, and I never forget a voice. Trust me on this. Shen Yi had taught Cao Chunhua to read as a child. Back then, he had seemed like a perfectly ordinary little girl. Who would have imagined that when he grew up and recovered his male identity, he would transform into someone like this? Shen Yi, a pedantic old bachelor, couldn't stand, much less enjoy, being the subject of Cao Chunhua's bold flirtations. He prickled with goose flesh and took a subconscious step in Chen Qingxu's direction, shying away from those wily fingers. Raising her eyes, Miss Chen parted her noble lips to coolly admonish Cao Chunhua. Xiao Cao. All the members of the Lin Yuan Pavilion, the individual everyone most feared offending was Miracle Dr. Chen. Cao Chunhua snapped his mouth shut. Straightening up on his horse, and in a great show of decency, he explained his analysis to Shen Yi. General, it seems to me that the 18 tribes have come to negotiate in earnest. Handing over the Wolf King would be far too humiliating. Perhaps they're hoping to shift blame for the incident in the capital to their puppet ruler, the second prince, to keep the peace. Shunyi tapped his fingers lightly on his horse's bridle. Hold on. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Somehow, I feel the barbarians have given up too easily. He had confronted the people of the 18 tribes too many times to be unfamiliar with their nature. These shepherds were incredibly tenacious and would give up only when death stared them in the face. The Black Iron Battalion had advanced to this point by leveraging threats. They had yet to cross their enemy's defense line, much less launch an actual attack. If Shunyi wasn't mistaken, the 18 tribes should still have the strength to resist for quite a while. Cao Chunhua looked again at the wagons, presumably full of violet gold. He licked his lips. Then what should we do? Should we let them in or not? Shunyi opted for vigilance. Archers, stand by with Parhelion arrows at the ready. Allow no barbarians to approach our perimeter. Send for the gold valuators. Have them inspect all the wagons. Cao Chunhua's expression was solemn as he turned to meet Shunyi's gaze. Both remembered the giant kite packed with barbarians that had flown into Yanhui town all those years ago. If their adversary were anything else, they could at the very least be trusted not to harm their own children. But Jiaolan Yinghuo didn't bow to ordinary logic. He was more than capable of using his son's life to dupe the enemy into opening their gates. At Shunyi's orders, the Black Iron Battalion soldiers readied their weapons. Killing intent surged toward the northern barbarian delegation. The second prince was shaking so badly he was about to topple from his horse. Soon thereafter, a group of highly trained gold valuators approached the barbarian delegation and began to open and inspect their wagons. As Shunyi and the rest watched, several huge wagons full of enough violet gold to make one's heart burn with envy were revealed to his eyes. The gold valuators dared not cut corners. They checked each and every wagon for quality and dipped specially made rods into the sealed compartments to verify the volume of violet gold within. When these violet gold covered rods were delivered to Shunyi, their gradation showed the wagons filled to capacity with the precious fuel. The gold valuators gave their report. Sir, there are no problems with the purity. It meets the standards established for annual tributes. Shunyi murmured his acknowledgement, but his doubts remained. He glanced up at the second prince. A grubby purplish mark, like a lash from a whip, marred the young man's forehead. His face was covered in tears and snot, and though his mouth gaped as if he were screaming, he made no sound. Chen Qingxu spoke quietly. General Shun, that purple mark. I heard about it during my travels. It's a shamanic technique used to silence its victims. That man's body is stiff as a board. He's probably been tied to his saddle and can't even cough. In another hour, the mark will blacken and he will collapse and die. Even if an autopsy is conducted, the coroner will only find that he suffered sudden, intense heart palpitations and died of fear. Shani didn't have time to blush from shyness. He shouted, Wait! Stop them right there! A black hawk circling overhead called sharply, Halt! The barbarian's second prince seemed to lose his balance as his horse jerked to a stop. He tipped forward, his stiff riding boots striking the edge of one of the violet gold wagons. A resounding clang reverberated into the distance. The corner of the wagon was hollow. Shunyi's pupils contracted. Retreat! The order was still ringing in the air when a member of the barbarian delegation lunged at one of the violet gold wagons and was shot and killed by an arrow from a sharp-eyed Black Hawk overhead. The Black Iron Battalion soldiers silently and swiftly drew back. Shunyi grabbed the bridle of Chen Qingxu's horse and wheeled the animal around before slapping it on the rear and sending it to the back of the column. A skinny Tianlang youth was hiding under the wagon. One wave of the fire starter in his hand lit the hidden fuse tucked beneath the cargo. He bared a terrifying smile heavenward. Sparks shot into the sky like a flash of lightning. The first violet gold wagon exploded, turning the boy to ash. A shock wave swept outward from the center of the blast as the tower of purple flame rose dozens of meters into the sky. The air seemed to boil as ripples of heat rolled over the Black Iron warriors, bringing up the rear, scorching the ice-cold backplates of their black armor a vivid red, melting through their gold tanks and setting off a chain of fatal explosions. Chapter 110. Swords Drawn. Tangled in endless nightmares, Guyuan missed a step and tumbled deeper into the darkness. His body spasmed as he awoke in a sea of pitch black. He was alert the moment he opened his eyes, his mind snapping to attention as he recalled where he was and what tasks still required his attention. An ice-cold cheek was suddenly pressed to his forehead. Guyuan started in surprise. No one in the Black Iron Battalion would dare to treat him so intimately, much less the soldiers of the Jiangbei garrison. He detected the scent of pacifying fragrance, and as his half-blind eyes adjusted to the gloom, a fuzzy silhouette materialized. His clammy skin had scarcely dried before he was drenched in a second wave of panicked sweat. What is he doing here? A twist of Changgang's fingers lit the simple gas lamp above the cot. He silently took a handkerchief from the basin beside the bed and wiped away the sweat beading on Guyuan's forehead. Guyuan's body felt boneless. An invisible wound seemed buried deep within his chest, aching dully with the slightest strain. Flustered, Guyuan fumbled through the blankets and closed his fingers around the frame of his glass monocule. I can do it myself. Head bowed, Changgang ignored him, catching his wrist and pinning it down with ease. An inexplicable feeling of guilt rose in Guyuan. He licked his lips nervously. No one talked, right? Changgang wiped down his body with quick, efficient movements, then gathered Guyuan's lapels tightly together and tugged the blankets over to bundle Guyuan up. Finally, he lifted his head and met Guyuan's eyes. Guyuan flashed him a hasty smile. Changgang gazed back at him, expressionless. Tucking his hand weakly out from beneath the blankets, Guyuan reached out and laid a hand on the back of Changgang's neck. After gently kneading his nape a few times, he ran a finger down the line of Changgang's jaw. You've just seen me, and you're already pulling a long face? Has your Yifu's beauty faded so fast? Struck by a sudden, perverse urge to see how long Guyuan could keep up his act, Changgang asked icily, And what exactly is the matter with you? Through narrowed eyes, Guyuan read Changgang's lips and responded without a change in expression. I caught a cold. Changgang was speechless. He'd expected Guyuan to fob him off. He never imagined he would be so half-assed about it. Guyuan was determined to cheerfully muddle his way through this interrogation, so he patted Changgang's cheek. Come here, let me see if you lost any weight. Changgang slapped his hand away. Guzhishi, he snapped, furious. Immediately, Guyuan switched tactics. Scowling, he summoned an imperious air that seemed to declare, through sheer intensity of his furrowed brow, a martial law as immovable as the mountains. What tongues have been wagging? General Zhong has scarcely passed, yet the Jiangbei garrison has grown so undisciplined? Changgang took a deep breath. Back at the morning hall. The hypocrite Guyuan cut in to sling the first accusation. Which little bastard was standing guard at the morning hall? Get Yao Chongzi here. I need to ask him whom I ought to court-martial. Changgang gently ground his teeth. Guyuan shook his head, as if he weren't lying like a cheap rug. The Jiangbei Navy is young indeed. This would never happen in the Black Iron Battalion. Is that so? Changgang smiled thinly. Well, I'm the little bastard you're looking for. So, is this marshal going to court-martial me? Marshal Gu, ever versatile master of the 36 stratagems, had never truly experienced what it meant to be reduced to silence until this moment. Changgang had a belly full of questions, but he knew Guyuan would never answer them honestly. Besides, he couldn't bear to see this idiot work himself into a lather fielding his inquiries. Although the words gathered on the tip of his tongue, he shoved them back down again and again. He was saved from his dilemma by a sudden disturbance outside the tent. One of Guyuan's personal guards called urgently, Your Highness, Prince Yan. Frowning, Changgang stood up and stepped outside. What's going on? He was still speaking when the ground began to quake. Changgang's expression turned grim. These were the tremors of naval long guns shelling the near shore. Suddenly, Changgang realized the Jiangbei garrison was ablaze with light. The rumble of approaching hoofbeats filled his ears as cold light glinted from iron armor. A copper squall blared overhead, the sound heavy in the humid Jiangbei air, reverberating into the distance like muted thunder and startling the north bank awake. Gas lamps blinked into existence one by one aboard the sea dragons anchored offshore, their chilly gleam piercing the thick mist as they readied themselves to cast off, while the white beams of the watchtowers swept across the breadth of Jiangbei. They were under attack. Even without his hearing, Guyuan recognized the shaking earth and the flashes of light spilling into the tent. His first act when he arrived was to strengthen the defensive perimeter. But that had only been to bolster morale. He hadn't actually expected the usually imperturbable far western fleet to launch a surprise attack on the Jiangbei Navy at a time like this. Sometimes, no matter how desperate one's efforts, they were still bound by the plans of heaven. Guyuan had exhausted his mental reserves countering the Westerners. How was he to know his enemy was dealing with a fire in their own backyard? One that had mysteriously resulted in the appointment of a commander whose battle tactics were completely antithetical to those of his predecessor. Guyuan had no time to examine this sudden shift. Throwing on his outer robe, he rose from the bed and stumbled as his legs nearly gave out on him. It was as if he had taken 5 kilograms of muscle-weakening powder. A black hawk screeched down from the sky, landing directly before the commander's tent. Before the soldier could open his mouth, a red-tagged emergency dispatch tumbled from his hands, rolling over the ground until it came to a stop under Guyuan's outstretched foot. Guyuan clutched at the headboard and bent down with great difficulty to retrieve it, opening the mail canister under the light of the gas lamp as the Black Hawk quickly gave his report. Sir, the 18 tribes used their surrender as a pretext to bring a caravan of 6 wagons full of violet gold to our border. The leaders were all suicide fighters. They set fire to the violet gold and used the explosion to break through our defensive lines. Right after, an army of elite troops numbering the tens of thousands turned out in full force. They seem intent on fighting to the death. Guyuan looked up from the letter in his hands. What is the situation? How many have we lost? The subordinate left too quickly and does not know. After a moment to collect himself, Guyuan gritted his teeth and scraped together enough strength to grab the windslasher hanging at the head of the bed. Bring me my suit of heavy armor, he ordered. Right now, only a heavy armor's built-in support could compensate for his physical weakness. Raising a hand to stop the guard from leaving, Chang'eng turned to Guyuan. Zishi, you stay here and oversee the main force. I'll go, he said, voice low. Guyuan gazed at him steadily, his mouth pressed into a tight line. Chang'eng recognized his expression. It was a sign that he was about to say no. Before he could, Chang'eng spoke up. You don't trust me? Guyuan sighed. Chang'eng extended a hand. Give me the windslasher. I'll go in your stead. If you trust me, don't set 1 foot outside this tent. The distant flames of war danced in Chang'eng's eyes. His pupils seemed to catch fire, burning with the intensity of Great Liang's desperate fight for survival. Taking cautious hold of one end of the windslasher, Chang'eng slowly but firmly pulled it from Guyuan's grip. The task was not a difficult one. Guyuan's wrist was shaking, drained of strength. Chang'eng slung the black iron weapon across his back. Please allow me to be the marshal's pawn, he said, dipping in a shallow bow. Guyuan stared deep into his eyes before spinning to face the Black Hawk. Bring me a sand table, he instructed. You'll act as my runner. Chang'eng strode from the tent, windslasher in hand. The western sea monster that had traversed oceans to arrive on these shores slowly surfaced in the fog-shrouded river. In its massive shadow, countless western dragonets sliced through the water in parallel formation, closing in fast as tiger sharks. Guyuan's defensive line reacted immediately. Warning sirens blared, and the Jiangbei garrison's light cavalry, which had been standing at the ready, split into 3 groups and sped toward key strategic positions along the northern bank. They ran headfirst into the far western navy, secretly attempting to make landfall. Blood streamed down the river as artillery fires twisted across the water's surface in a brilliant sea of fireworks. Cannons, maintain barrage fire. Chang'eng called orders from horseback. Parhelions, provide covering fire while they reload. Black Hawks, stand by. I need you suited up and beyond the Parhelions' firing range in 5 minutes. We control the skies. Keep the enemy's armored hawks grounded on that sea monster flagship. Pin them down and take them out. Tighten the right flank. All sea dragons, load gunpowder and prepare to get underway. For a moment, the runner beside Chang'e thought he'd misheard. Did your majesty say all the dragons? Are we engaging the enemy on all fronts? Chang'e glanced down at the soldier from his seat astride his horse. Correct. It's time to show these foreigners that Great Liang has a navy as well. Once upon a time, Great Liang's navy was so weak it collapsed from a single blow. Even its commander had perished in that battle. In the aftermath, it had fled northward in a panic, hastily reorganized by a civil official who could barely ride a horse. Scattered survivors of the Navy joined forces with their brothers in arms from military branches all over the country who had likewise lost their command structure to war. They formed the most oddly assorted band of soldiers imaginable and returned to the place they once suffered their greatest humiliation. The former ground troops got seasick, completely disoriented the moment they stepped onto a boat. They struggled to make sense of the complicated navigation systems that lagged far behind their enemies' advanced sea dragon warships. All of that seemed like a lifetime ago. The Jiangbei Navy had undergone 2 major reorganizations since its establishment. The Lingshu Institute had worked in the shadows, overhauling the Navy's warships 3 times, even sending over a replica of the Far Westerners' lightning-fast Tiger Shark dragonettes. Now, as a rare northerly breeze blew over the twin banks of the Yangtze River, the altar lamps in the morning hall flared with bright light, setting the hanging screens aglow. The white cloth fluttered like soul-summoning flags, stark against the darkness of the Jiangbei encampment. It was as though the valiant spirit of old General Zhong still walked among the living. The blade had been forged. It could only be whetted on the blood of its enemies. Unable to see or hear, Guyun relied on the tremors beneath his feet to determine the distance of the fight. Though he couldn't monitor the battlefront in person, he didn't appear worried in the least. The Black Hawk at his side was stunned to find Guyun had a map of the Jiangbei Navy's defenses laid out in his head. The strong and weak points in their formation, the places where the enemy was likely to break through. He predicted them all without fail. He had already given Chang'e his command on the front line, and now he magnanimously gave him his unreserved trust as well. He issued no orders, allowing Chang'e to marshal Jiangbei's 3 divisions as he saw fit. Guyun kept one eye on the breadth of the battlefield, gauging the distribution of violet gold and ammunition to the various squadrons. At the same time, he considered the red-tagged emergency dispatch, splitting his attention between the northern and southern fronts to encompass every theater of war across Great Liang. The Far Westerners' assault tonight was a performance put on for the barbarians. They fought not for total victory, but for the upper hand at the bargaining table. If Great Liang could hold the northern front, these Far Westerners would become little more than a band of buffoons. But if the north should fall? As the smoke of endless cannon fire wrapped Jiangbei in a hazy fog, the silver landscape of the northern border boiled into a searing heat. Jiala Yinghuo had sacrificed a band of suicide fighters and his own son to blast his way clear with precious violet gold. An army of northern barbarian warriors rushed out in the wake of the explosion, hell-bent on slaughtering all in their path. Shen Yi immediately pulled the Black Iron Battalion, which had advanced deep into enemy territory, back 6 kilometers and led their adversaries on a wild chase through the snow. That the soldiers of the Black Iron Battalion were of the highest caliber went without saying. They proceeded to stretch the barbarians' offensive line over a vast area, reducing deep columns of soldiers to a single man. The barbarians had flipped on their adversaries as fast as a scholar might flip the pages of a book, but the soldiers of the northern border garrison were accustomed to their good neighbors' volatile moods. Upon seeing the Black Iron Battalion signal, they moved out at once. He Zhonghui and Shen Yi had worked together for years, and their collaboration was seamless. The northern border garrison reinforcements soon tore through the enemy's overextended offense. But no one anticipated that Jiala Yinghuo would empty his coffers to the last cent. The barbarian light cavalry fell away to reveal a small formation of war chariots he had painstakingly stockpiled over the years. Several hundred suits of armor turned out in full strength, using their considerable firepower to push forward like a giant net, smashing directly into the night whirlwind that was the Black Iron Battalion. The battlefield lapsed into stalemate. Less than an hour later, the northern barbarians' reinforcements arrived, neither human soldiers nor steel armor, but rather a large convoy of wagons filled with violet gold. Wave after wave was set afire as the northern front transformed into a sea of scalding steam. Even the blizzard winds couldn't dispel the blistering heat. The temperature rose dramatically, and swaths of ice and snow melted into hot springs that seeped into the parched earth. White mist swallowed the plains in every direction as purple fire painted a singular tragic scene. A suit of armor needed only get a little too close for its steel surface to cook its wearer. The barbarians seemed determined to hollow out the north. Working without cease, they gave everything, their chariots, their people, even the heart of their earth, as fuel to burn out a path in a dazzling pyrotechnic display. By nightfall, the Black Iron Battalion had no choice but to retreat once again. Chapter 111. Eternity. The Battle of the Northern Border devolved into chaos. Jiala Yinghuo, last of his family line, seemed increasingly unhinged, preferring to die in a fight to the death rather than allow his enemy a single drop of violet gold. Wherever his troops fell short in terms of strength, he ordered his subordinates to set alight their violet gold wagons and carve a fiery path through their adversaries' defenses. Brandishing hellfire, he fought the Black Iron Battalion to an impasse. As for Great Liang's troops, they could do nothing but resign themselves to these bizarre tactics. Through this sort of back and forth, the battle dragged on to the third day. Cao Chunhua no longer bothered with his appearance. His mink fur had been pressed into service as a fan as hot sweat dripped from his temples. He glanced enviously at Shen Yi, who was stripped to the waist. Good heavens! Has it ever been this warm during the second month on the northern border? You must be feeling nice and cool, General Shen. Shen Yi shot him an irritated glare. Like hell I'm feeling cool. His back was mottled with burns. He hadn't had time to deal with them on the front line, so it was only now, when He Zhonghui relieved him, that Shen Yi could finally catch his breath, remove his armor, and treat his wounds. The blisters from the burns had been rubbed raw against his armor, leaving his back a bloody mess. He looked as if he'd been skinned alive. Seeing Shen Yi's shoulder tight with strain, Chen Qingxu hurried and asked, "General, am I pressing too hard?" Shen Yi flushed and shook his head. Even the searing pain of the burns couldn't distract him from the humiliation he felt in that moment. Exposing his chest and back to a young woman like this, it was so improper, so distasteful, he could barely speak to Miss Chen for shame. Chen Qingxu assumed the redness of his neck and ears was due to the heat. She felt a bit conflicted. She had been in the thick of many Jianghu gang fights and had worked in a field hospital for some time. In these situations, she had always come and gone with ease. She had little first-hand battlefield experience. The current clash was worlds different from Gu Yuan's cunning takedown of Prince Wei's attempted insurrection all those years ago. When two armies composed of tens of thousands of seasoned troops met in pitched battle, the screams of soldiers and horses, the roar of cannons, all of it blurred into an overwhelming pandemonium. It was too easy to lose one's way at the slightest distraction. Never mind remaining calm and collected as the commander in such a battle. The fact that these soldiers could follow their superiors' orders in the midst of such a din was a testament to their stringent training. On a battlefield like this one, no matter how capable or skilled one was in martial arts, their ability to enact tangible change was limited. Even the most indomitable stone pillar would soon be overcome by the sea of soldiers and wall of artillery fire. When Chen Qingxu worked at the field hospital, she had treated soldier after soldier who had lost an arm or a leg and suffered the most horrifying physical trauma imaginable. Now she saw with her own eyes how these wounds came to be. Like a cave of demons that consume human flesh. Chun Shu thought as she trimmed necrotic flesh from Shen Yi's body with nimble fingers before carefully cleaning and applying medicine to his burns. When the two armies clashed, Shen Yi attended to all corners of the battlefield. Yet, despite being pulled in every direction, he had still made a point of looking after her. Grabbing the bridle of her horse, he had stared intently at Chun Shu for a moment before telling her somewhat stiffly, "Stay with me." For some inexplicable reason, that look had left an impression on her more profound than even the towering flames of war. "General, you mustn't wear light armor anymore," Chun Shu said. "It's too heavy and will chafe against your wounds. You will be much worse off if these fester and you get a fever." Shen Yi was drenched in sweat. Rationally, he knew Chun Shu didn't mean anything by her quiet urging, but he still broke out in gooseflesh. His body tugged itself apart in disorder as his skin tried to decide whether to sweat or shiver. He was saved by a messenger bursting in. "General Shen," the soldier cried, gasping for breath. "Old General Tsai was grazed by a barbarian cannon just now and fell from his horse. The enemy is rallying its troops there to break through our defensive line." Shen Yi lurched to his feet. The motion caused the burns on his back to flare with such agony he nearly howled to the heavens. But as interim commander-in-chief standing before the young lady, he fancied he couldn't do it. "Report! General! An emergency dispatch from Jiangbei." When Gu Yuan had left south years ago to catch the runaway Chang'e, it had taken him several days to fly from the Silk Road in the western regions to Jiangnan in Black Hawk armor. Since then, the Lingshu Institute had upgraded the gold tanks on Great Liang's military scouts and significantly increased their maximum velocity. Now, in an emergency, they could traverse the distance between Jiangbei and the northern border in less than a day. Gu Yuan's name was like a pillar of support for Shen Yi amid the chaos. Upon hearing this, he immediately relaxed. His entire body swayed in place and he nearly fell over. Shen Yi reached out on instinct and grabbed something to steady himself. Only when he returned to his senses did he realize Miss Chun had lent him her hand. Miss Chun's hand was like the rest of her, slightly cool to the touch. Her fingers were so slender as to be almost bony, yet possessed the firm strength of a master of her craft. Mortified, Shen Yi snatched his hand back and turned to the messenger. "What did the marshal say?" The Black Hawk blurted his message in a single breath. "The Far Western Army launched a surprise attack on the Jiangbei garrison. The marshal told me to inform all the generals here, should the northern border fall, prepare to beg for forgiveness before your ancestors." Shen Yi felt a weight as heavy as Mount Tai fall on his shoulders with a thunderous crash, the word ancestor smashing into him with such violence he nearly spat blood. He wanted to cry, but he had no tears. Shen Yi had never envied Gu Yuan's glory as the leader of the 3 divisions of the Black Iron Battalion. Now, he wished for nothing more than to weep and beg Gu Yuan to return from Jiangbei and relieve Shen Yi of his command. Didn't he say he'd be back after checking on the southern front? Didn't he say appointing Shen Yi commander-in-chief was a temporary measure? Shen Yi felt the greatest tragedy of his life with his poor judgment of character when it came to making friends. He couldn't make sense of it. He was simply an ordinary man with an overabundance of compassion and a complete and utter lack of ambition. He had zero interest in toadying up to powerful officials, nor did he wish his achievements to be remembered for all eternity. So how exactly had the astronomical burden of the northern border landed on his unassuming head? Hu Ronghui rushed in, bringing a wave of heat. "Jiping, Cai Lao's troops can't hold the barbarians much longer. I'm going to back him up." Shen Yi snapped back to his senses. He pinched hard at the space between his brows before accepting Gu Yuan's token of authority from the messenger with a solemn expression. "You can't leave. The Black Hawks are all that's suppressing the barbarians' movements right now. Let me think. General Shen, this humble general is willing to go." Shen Yi raised his head, seeking the source of the voice, and spotted a young man standing in the corner. He looked like he had yet to come of age, his cheeks still childish and round. Cao Chunhua reminded him quietly, "Old General Cai's youngest son. He's been fighting in the vanguard here on the northern border his entire time. He's only 19, but he's crossed swords with the barbarians several dozen times." Seeing he had Shen Yi's attention, the young man took another step forward and repeated himself in resolute tones. "This humble general is willing to go. I'll die before I allow the barbarians to advance another step." Shen Yi started in surprise. For an instant, he felt he was seeing Gu Yuan in his youth. More than a decade ago, when the news of rebellion in the western regions reached the capital, the late emperor and his courtiers, drunk on the illusion of peace and prosperity, had stared at each other aghast. Pandemonium had broken out in the Grand Assembly the next day. Some officials had gone so far as to suggest distributing wanted posters among the common folk in hopes of finding and recalling old General Zhong Chan from retirement. It had been the orphan of the Gu family who calmly brought the frenzied arguing to an end. At 17 years of age, Gu Yuan had yet to shed the fearless arrogance of youth. This subject is willing to go. Our enemies in the borderlands near Xiliang are no more than a band of bungling clowns. Do they think the Windslashers of the Black Iron Battalion are too rusty to part the heads of scoundrels like themselves from their necks? Now, little General Tsai sniffed and said without batting an eye, "The mad barbarian dogs are merely mounting a last-ditch struggle. This humble general may be young and inexperienced, but I have strength enough to hoist my father's blade. I will ensure none of them come out of this battle alive." The older generation of famous generals had either died on the battlefield or lost their edge with age. Yet the mountains and rivers remained unchanged. There would always be youngsters who were fearless in their naivety as they donned their armor, drew their parhelion bows, and rose above the rest. When a decade passed, another decade would come. After a century passed, another century would follow, and so ever onward for all eternity. Shun Yi's frantic thoughts went still all at once. He handed the token of authority to little General Tsai. "Very well, my good brother. Go on." When he was gone, Shun Yi opened Gu Yuan's emergency dispatch. The oral proclamation the Black Hawk relayed had been harsh and uncompromising, but Gu Yuan's letter was perfectly reasonable. "The barbarians are cornered beasts fighting for its life. This will be their last stand. The 18 tribes have already been rocked by internal conflict. They can't drag this fight out for long. The first few days will be the most difficult, but so long as we hold our ground, we can expect their morale to slowly and steadily decline. When the time comes, call for a ceasefire, dispatch an envoy to sow further dissension among the 18 tribes. In the days that follow, perhaps we can settle things on the northern border once and for all. Be careful, but do not fear. I may not be with you in person, but I march with the Black Iron Battalion in spirit." Shun Yi's eyes stung. "Relay my orders to all units. Pin the enemy down. We don't give them an inch." Unbeknownst to Shun Yi, the man who boasted so easily about his spirit marching with the Black Iron Battalion was not at all relaxed when he penned this letter. It took great effort for Gu Yuan to steady his hand, and by the time he finished stamping his personal seal, a stack of battlefield reports had gathered on his desk. Perhaps to keep Gu Yuan from worrying, Chang'e had appointed a special team of light cavalrymen to ride between the front line and the commander's tent with the latest developments on the battlefield. All his life, there had rarely been a military engagement that did not require Gu Yuan to personally step onto the field, so this was quite a novel experience. Inside the commander's tent, no extraneous information disturbed his thought process. He didn't need to worry about evading overt or covert enemy attacks, nor deal with the violent emotional upheavals of combat. On the contrary, he was practically a bystander as he observed the entire battlefield with a bird's eye view. The opening stages of this battle were a test of the tightness of the Jiangbei garrison's formations and their navy's vigilance. Old General Zhong and Gu Yuan had laid a strong foundation that allowed their troops to easily withstand the far westerners' bombardment. Once this foundation had been blasted away and the two armies' strengths were evenly matched, however, their commander's skill and experience would determine the rest. Gu Yuan's back prickled with cold sweat when he heard the Black Hawk's battlefield report. The enemy commander had laid out his troops with a shrewd ruthlessness. Whoever he was, the man was a true expert at naval strategy. Even if Gu Yuan personally took to the field, he would have to proceed with utmost caution. A Black Hawk darted in to report the latest developments. "A small group of enemy ships in the southwestern quadrant has fallen behind the rest of the fleet. Prince Yan has adjusted the vanguard's course to break through the enemy line." Gu Yuan's heart stuttered in his chest as he jumped to his feet. Unlike the vanguard, who were required only to be brave above all else, a commander's blood might burn hot. It was critical that their mind remain cool when confronting the enemy. Commanders who lacked experience and got caught up in the killing could easily get carried away by their troops' bloodlust. He promptly broke his promise. "Bring me my armor and prepare my horse." For Chang'e, this battle had proved extremely draining. During the capital siege, he needed only concern himself with defending the area above and below a small section of the city wall. Not to mention, he'd gone into that fight expecting to be killed in action. This time, he fought with the entire northern half of the nation and tens of thousands of Jiangbei troops at his back. The sailors of the Liangjiang Navy weren't fitted with hawk armor, and the Jiangbei garrison's hawk division was even greener than its navy. When it came to combat, they were more difficult to command than the armored hawks of the northern camp, let alone the Black Hawks. Meanwhile, the enemy utilized that impregnable sea monster warship as their center of operations. After weathering Great Liang's first wave of attack, they steadily seized the tempo of the battle. Chang'e searched anxiously for any weakness in their ranks. If his forces couldn't break through, they would have to remain on the defensive. The instant his vanguard tore a hole in the enemy's left flank, he instinctively directed the main battleship fleet to press their advantage. Chang'e was, by nature, extraordinarily calm and perceptive. The chase had barely begun before he sensed something amiss. By then, it was too late. The far western corvettes had swarmed forward at full speed and surrounded their enemy, severing Chang'e's path of retreat. "What should we do, Your Highness? Should we attempt to return to port?" Chang'e's palms turned clammy with sweat as Guyuan's words echoed in his ears. "On the battlefield, whoever clings to life is the first to die." "Don't be absurd. Full speed ahead," Chang'e said coldly. "It's but a swarm of flies on our tail. Ignore them and stick to the plan. Puncture the enemy's left flank." He would transform this entire fleet into a fearless vanguard that didn't flinch in the face of death. Was their enemy hoping to catch a turtle in a jar? In that case, he'd simply shatter that jar. The messenger shivered at the ruthless edge in his voice. "Yes, sir." The fleet of sea dragons was like a spinning wind slasher. They dove into the heart of the enemy formation, fighting at close quarters. Chang'e knew if they took too long smashing through their adversaries' defenses, they would find themselves hemmed in on all sides once the troops on their tail caught up. The Jiangbei Navy's long guns and short barrel cannons loaded their ammunition. Firelight sparked in the darkness over the sea dragon warships like scattered stars. It was the glow of the cannon's gold tanks. Chang'e wiped sweaty palms on his filigree sachet stuffed full of pacifying fragrance and opened his mouth to give his next orders when something strange happened. The enemy ships blocking their path suddenly and inexplicably melted away. Chang'e stared. What new ruse was this? But there was no way to pull the brakes on a fleet that was sailing full bore. Great Liang's navy plowed straight through the enemy fleet, emerging at their adversaries' rear unimpeded. Through night vision field scopes, a sailsman on the enemy command ship could be seen frantically waving his flags, bidding the errant ships to come back around. The retreating far western corvettes ignored the order completely, openly defying commands as they cut through the water and refusing to lure the Jiangbei Navy's cannon fire. Chang'e was baffled, but there was no time to waste. He ordered the cannons to switch targets, redirecting all their firepower to their rear with a blast that parted the Yangtze River. The high-speed tiger sharks chasing them had no time to evade. They were struck head-on. As the small vessels took fire, their high-efficiency gold tanks detonated in a chain of explosions. The surface of the water seemed to boil as Great Liang's ships shot out from the fray. Having somehow survived the trip through enemy lines without mishap, they retreated to a safe distance. Aboard the western flagship, Mr. Jia was fuming. "Bastard! He dares disobey orders in the middle of battle?" The lines of the Pope's face were so severe they seemed carved by a knife. The left flank that had bolted were the warships led by the holy emissary. Just then, the man in question was likewise gnashing his teeth. His small fleet had been meant to provide backup, but after several changes to formation, the dastardly old Pope had shoved his squadron to the van. Only when Great Liang's warships were bearing down on him did he realize he'd been set up as cannon fodder. Even the king couldn't fault the Pope if his emissary was tragically killed in action. The holy emissary refused to take the fall. He withdrew without a second thought, caring not a whit that doing so would scupper the far Western Navy's battle formation. Chang'e was like a venomous snake. The moment he had the opportunity to turn the tables, he reared up and barraged the enemy mercilessly in retaliation for the fright he'd suffered a moment ago. The Westerners now found themselves on the back foot. The momentum of the battle had shifted. On the riverbank, a light cavalryman raced to the commander's tent to relay his report to Guyuan. Guyuan had already donned his armor and mounted his horse. Upon hearing the news, an odd expression stole over his face. He thought somewhat helplessly that maybe it wasn't too far-fetched to claim that Great Liang's fortunes rose and fell with Prince Yan, that maybe it was actually true. Reining his horse around, he headed back without a word to the main commander's tent, where he stowed his armor and ordered his men to keep quiet about the fact he had stepped out. After Chang'e sank their left flank, the Western Navy was like a man with a lame leg. But even at such a substantial disadvantage, the Pope had a fearsome command of the seas and remained a formidable opponent for the young and inexperienced Prince Yan. The battle dragged on till dawn. Guyuan reached up and turned off the gas lamp. Then he picked up his brush and penned 3 letters in rapid succession. The first was an order for the transport of violet gold. The second was a request for armor and engines from the nearest branch of the Lingshu Institute. Last of all was a military brief to be sent to the capital. When he finished, he rubbed his stiff neck and instructed the Black Hawk standing by, "Tell His Majesty Prince Yan, there's no need to pursue if the Westerners retreat." The Black Hawk started in surprise. Before he could ask Guyuan how he knew the Westerners would retreat, a messenger burst into the tent. "Sir, the enemy flagship is withdrawing south." Guyuan showed no sign of surprise. He merely waved a hand toward the Black Hawk. Not daring to delay, the soldier took to the sky to deliver the message. Freed of dividing his attention between the various acute crises that developed in battle, Guyuan could instead devote himself wholly to analyzing the entire field. He had determined the depth of the enemy's violet gold reserves hours ago. After fighting through the night, their adversary had more or less reached their limit. When their violet gold tanks ran empty, their enemy would have no choice but to return to their encampment empty-handed and tally their disastrous number of casualties. Conflict in the ranks was sure to follow. Rather than continuing to advance, it would be more effective for Great Liang's navy to apply pressure from afar. Less than an hour later, the Western Navy ordered a general retreat, just as he'd expected. The night raid was declared a great failure. They hadn't even made a landfall on the northern bank. To show he was a man of his word, in lieu of stepping out of the commander's tent, Guyuan stood at the door to greet Chang'e. He paid no mind to the blood-staining Chang'e's clothes as he spread his arms to embrace him. Only then did Chang'e realize he was utterly spent. He swayed on his feet as he wrapped his hands around Guyuan's waist and murmured into his ear, "I don't want you to go to war ever again." Well, okay. Lovely. Surprise attacks just coming out of nowhere. That's completely fine or whatever. I don't really have much to say this time around, but everything that I want to say, oddly enough, is surrounding Shen Yi. So the first bullet point that I made was that actually this is something I've loved about Shen Yi since the beginning, is he's always had unwavering faith in Guyuan. When it comes to going to battle and stuff like that, he doesn't have a question. He's like, okay, if Guyuan said it, we're good. If I'm panicking about something and then he says, don't be concerned, I'm good. And I just think that's so cool. Obviously it's merited, it's warranted for him to have that faith in Guyuan, but I just love to see it, because sometimes in life, even after someone shows you who they are, even after they prove to you what they can do, sometimes we just be liking to doubt people, just because. And so I love that he doesn't do that. And then even more specifically, just going to that letter that Guyuan sent him. First off, I don't know why, but that letter just, That ending, it just rocked me to my core when he was like, "Be careful, but do not fear. I may not be with you in person, but I march with you. I march with the Black Iron Battalion in spirit." That just that was exactly what Shunyi needed because he was having a bit of anxiety, and it almost felt like Guyun knew exactly what he needed to reassure his friend because he wasn't coming back originally, like he said. And so I appreciated that so freaking much. And then the last thing I want to say is to me, it's just really funny that Shunyi lacks ambition, yet he, on multiple occasions, has been given moments to shine, essentially. And, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times that's how it happens in life. When you are just living your life as an honest person, doing the things that you want to do, care to do, or that you are just simply faithful to, you find yourself being elevated whether you want to or not. You find yourself in situations where you have more power and elevation and you weren't even looking for it. And that's what happened with Shunyi. And it's like, okay, you may not have these ambitions, but at the end of the day, it's cool to know that you can do these things that you've been doing. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You guys, the next video after this concludes the reading of volume 4, and then we'll be on the last one. So yeah, that's exciting. Okay, I hope you all enjoy your day or your night, and well, I'm Neiman.